November 16th, 1532. Cajamarca, Peru. The Inca Empire, the largest civilization in the Americas, commanding 12 million subjects across 2,000 miles of territory, stood at the height of its power. Emperor Atahualpa, having just won a brutal civil war against his half-brother, commanded an army of 80,000 battle-hardened warriors. Facing him, Francisco Pizarro and 168 Spanish conquistadors. The mathematics were impossible. The outcome predetermined. The Inca outnumbered the Spanish nearly 500 to 1. Yet by sunset that day, 7,000 Inca lay dead in the Plaza. Atahualpa was in chains, and an empire that had stood for centuries began its collapse into oblivion. The Spanish credited divine intervention. The Inca whispered of gods and demons. Historians point to steel and gunpowder, but the truth was far more terrifying. The true weapon that day had 4 legs, stood 6 feet tall, and the Peruvians had never seen anything like it before. They thought these creatures were gods themselves before we uncovered the truth about Pizarro's cavalry horses and how 62 stallions psychologically shattered an empire of millions. Make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're diving into one of history's most devastating uses of psychological warfare, where ignorance became a weapon more powerful than any sword. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you knew the true role horses played in the conquest of the Americas. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on that November day, you must first understand what the Spanish possessed that the Inca could not even comprehend. The year is 1532. Europe has known the horse for over 5,000 years. These animals are so integrated into European society that they are synonymous with power itself. Knights ride them. Kings breed them. Armies cannot function without them. The very word for a gentleman, cavalier, comes from the word for horseman. In European minds, the horse and human civilization are inseparable concepts. In the Americas, the horse has been extinct for over 10,000 years. When the last ice age ended, the ancient horses of the American continents vanished. The Inca Empire developed without them. He commanded an army that contemporary Spanish accounts estimated at between 40,000 and 80,000 men. These were not conscripts. These were veteran soldiers who had just finished a brutal campaign of conquest. When Pizarro's scouts first reported seeing the Inca army camped outside Cajamarca, the Spanish soldiers began writing their wills. What those Inca soldiers didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they were about to encounter a creature that would violate everything they understood about the natural world. They were about to face an animal that would seem to be a fusion of man and beast, moving with impossible speed, striking with devastating force, and appearing to their eyes as something supernatural. The stage was set for one of history's most catastrophic cultural misunderstandings. The first sighting occurred on November 15, 1532, one day before the massacre. Inca scouts returning from observing Pizarro's approach did not report seeing men and horses. They reported seeing creatures they could not categorize. According to later Spanish accounts compiled from Inca testimony, the scouts described beings that were split at the waist, human above, animal below. They moved faster than any runner. They were larger than llamas but shaped differently. When these creatures wanted to move at speed, they made a sound like thunder. Atahualpa listened to these reports with interest but not alarm. He had received other Spanish visitors before. In 1527, Spanish explorers under Bartolomé Ruiz had made contact with Inca merchants on the coast. The empire was aware that bearded strangers existed somewhere beyond their borders. But those previous encounters had been peaceful, curious exchanges. Atahualpa made a critical decision. He would meet these strangers personally, assess their intentions, and either incorporate them into his empire or destroy them. He was the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, son of the sun god Inti. What could 168 foreigners possibly threaten? The second incident occurred that same evening. Pizarro sent his brother Hernando and a captain named Hernando de Soto to Atahualpa's camp as emissaries. They rode horses. De Soto, eager to impress, performed a cavalry demonstration, galloping his horse at full speed toward where Atahualpa sat on his throne, pulling up sharply at the last moment. The Inca witnesses reacted with what the Spanish interpreted as fear, but the Inca chronicler Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, writing decades later from indigenous testimony, described something more complex. The Inca warriors who flinched at the horse's approach were executed that night by Atahualpa's order, not because they had shown cowardice, but because they had shown inappropriate fear in the presence of what might be a god. This is crucial to understanding what happened next. The Inca didn't simply fear the horses, they couldn't categorize them. In Quechua, the Inca language, there was no word for horse. They would eventually call them llama from Castile, or create new words entirely, but in that moment, they had no linguistic framework to process what they were seeing. Think about the psychological impact of this. Imagine you encounter a creature that looks like a centaur from mythology. Your brain cannot reconcile what you're seeing with what you know to be possible. Is this an animal? Is this a god? Are the human and horse parts separate beings working in perfect coordination, or are they one creature? The third incident happened throughout that night and into the morning. Pizarro, recognizing the psychological advantage the horses provided, made a calculated decision. He ordered his cavalry to remain mounted as much as possible. He wanted the Inca to see these creatures constantly, to be unable to separate man from horse, to believe they were dealing with a different type of being entirely. Spanish chronicles record that Inca messengers came throughout the night, bringing gift of food and drink, each time they stared at the horses. According to Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's cousin, who left one of the most detailed accounts of the conquest, the Inca could not take their eyes from the horses, which they had never seen. But here's where the horror deepens. It wasn't just ignorance. The Inca had a sophisticated theology involving divine manifestations. They believed the gods could take physical form, that supernatural beings walked among humans during pivotal moments in history. The Spanish, with their steel armor, their beards, which Andean peoples typically lacked, their incomprehensible language, and now these impossible creatures they seemed to merge with, fit uncomfortably into categories the Inca reserved for the divine or demonic. The fourth incident was the most telling. On the morning of November 16th, Atahualpa agreed to meet Pizarro in the main plaza of Cajamarca. He came in a procession with thousands of attendants, but, crucially, ordered his warriors to leave their weapons behind. Multiple explanations have been offered for this decision. Some historians argue it was a show of confidence. Others suggest Atahualpa believed he was meeting with ambassadors, not warriors, and that protocol demanded both sides come unarmed. But several Spanish chronicles record something more disturbing. Atahualpa specifically asked whether the creatures that were half man and half animal would be present. When told they would, he requested they be controlled and kept at a distance. The Spanish agreed but had no intention of honoring that agreement. What authorities would discover in the aftermath of what happened next would force a complete reevaluation of how psychological warfare could destroy civilizations. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The psychological horror of what these horses represented to people who had never conceived such creatures could exist is something we can barely fathom from our modern perspective. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries about how fear and misunderstanding changed history. Let's discover what happens next in the plaza at Cajamarca. November 16th, 1532. Mid-afternoon. The plaza at Cajamarca is packed with thousands of Inca attendants, nobles, and servants. Atahualpa sits on his ceremonial litter, carried on the shoulders of his highest-ranking lords. The Spanish are hidden in the buildings surrounding the plaza. Infantry in some structures, cavalry in their horses in others. The Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde approaches Atahualpa, carrying a Bible and a cross. Through an interpreter, he delivers the requerimiento, a legal document demanding Atahualpa accept Spanish sovereignty and Catholic Christianity. The exact exchange remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that Atahualpa rejected Spanish authority. Pizarro gives the signal. A cannon fires, and hell is unleashed in the plaza. What happened next is documented from multiple perspectives. Spanish conquistadors who were present, later testimonies from Inca survivors, and chronicles compiled in the decades afterward. The accounts align on the basic facts but diverge dramatically in their interpretation of what made the slaughter so one-sided. The Spanish infantry rushed into the plaza from the buildings, cutting down Inca attendants who had no weapons. But they were on foot. They could kill perhaps a few dozen people each before the Inca, despite lacking weapons, could overwhelm them through sheer numbers. The Spanish steel and armor provided an advantage, but not an insurmountable one. Then the cavalry charged. 62 horses carrying 62 armored men burst into the plaza at full gallop from 3 different directions simultaneously. Pedro Pizarro's account describes what he witnessed. The horses, with their chests against the Indians, pushed them back, and as the Indians were unarmed, they began to flee. Once they began to flee, we killed without stoppin'. But it's the Inca accounts, collected by Spanish chroniclers interviewing survivors, that reveal the true psychological devastation. They describe not a military defeat, but a complete sensory and cognitive overload. The horses moved at speeds they had never seen any creature move, approximately 30 miles per hour at full gallop. In a confined plaza packed with people, there was no way to track them, no way to predict where they would strike next. The sound was overwhelming, the thundering of hooves on stone, magnified by the enclosed space and the acoustics of the plaza, mixed with the screams of thousands of people and the shouts of the Spanish cavalry. The smell was alien and terrifying. Horses produce a distinctive odor, especially when galloping, a mixture of sweat, leather, and something fundamentally animal. The Inca had llamas, but llamas smell nothing like horses. This scent, combined with the smell of Spanish metal armor, gunpowder, and blood, created an olfactory assault that added to the disorientation. The visual impossibility was perhaps worst of all. To Inca eyes, these creatures appeared to be six-legged, two-headed beings that could rear up on two legs and strike down with hooves or weapons, then drop back to four legs and charge. They moved with a coordination that seemed supernatural. When a horse and rider turned sharply, leaning into the turn as cavalry are trained to do, it looked like a single creature banking like a bird of prey. Titu Cusi Yupanqui, an Inca nobleman who later wrote one of the few indigenous accounts of the conquest, described the horses as beings that ate people. This wasn't metaphorical. From the Inca perspective, the horses appeared to be biting and trampling people, and the distinction between rider and mount was not clear. The horse's mouth, with its large teeth, its aggressive posture when trained for warfare, and the fact that riders would lean forward while striking down with weapons, created the illusion that the entire creature was attacking. The massacre lasted approximately 2 hours. The Inca, trapped in the enclosed plaza, had only one exit, the gate at the far end. The press of bodies trying to escape was so intense that the wall of the plaza literally collapsed under the weight of people pushing against it. Spanish chroniclers note that many Inca died not from Spanish weapons, but from being trampled by their own people or crushed against the plaza walls. The cavalry pursued fleeing Inca for miles beyond the city. On open ground, with no obstacles, the psychological advantage of the horses became even more pronounced. A running human cannot outpace a galloping horse. The Inca warriors, looking back to see these impossible creatures gaining on them, many still believing they were facing divine or demonic beings, simply gave up or scattered into the mountains. By nightfall, estimates suggest between 6,000 and 10,000 Inca lay dead. The Spanish casualties? 0 deaths, a few wounded. One historical source mentions that Francisco Pizarro himself received the only Spanish injury, a cut on his hand when he pushed aside a Spanish sword that was about to kill Atahualpa, whom Pizarro wanted alive as a hostage. The physical evidence was undeniable. The stones of the plaza were slick with blood. The breach in the plaza wall stood as testament to the panic. And Atahualpa, the divine emperor, son of the sun god, was chained in a Spanish building like a common prisoner. But the true discovery, the one that would reshape understanding of the conquest, was this. The horses were the decisive weapon not because of their physical capabilities, but because they broke the Inca psychological framework for understanding reality. The immediate aftermath of Cajamarca reveals how completely the horse trauma had penetrated Inca consciousness. Atahualpa, while imprisoned, offered Pizarro a ransom that has become legendary. He would fill the room he was held in with gold once and twice with silver in exchange for his freedom. The room measured approximately 17 feet by 22 feet. He would fill it to a height he could reach with his hand raised above his head, approximately 8 feet. But there's a detail in the Spanish chronicles that's often overlooked. When negotiating the ransom, Atahualpa specifically asked whether the horses would be removed from the city. Even imprisoned, even stripped of his power, the emperor's concern centered on these creatures. Over the following months, as Inca runners spread throughout the empire collecting gold and silver for the ransom, word of what happened at Cajamarca spread with them. But the story that spread wasn't one of Spanish military superiority. It was a story of supernatural beings that could not be fought by conventional means. The Spanish chronicles from this period record an interesting phenomenon. As more Inca encountered horses over the following weeks and months, their reactions evolved. Some, realizing that the man and horse were separate entities, felt betrayed, as if they had been tricked by an elaborate deception. Others maintained that the horses were either demons or lesser gods, even after understanding they were animals. The evidence for this comes from what happened when the Spanish cavalry began to fragment across the Andes in conquest of other regions. Local Inca commanders, now warned about the horses, tried various strategies to counter them. Some tried to create obstacles in narrow mountain passes to prevent horses from charging. Others tried to capture horses to study them. One notable account describes Inca warriors who deliberately targeted horses in battle, having realized the rider became vulnerable once separated from his mount. But here's the crucial development. Even as tactical understanding of horses spread through the Inca military, the psychological damage had been done. The myth of Spanish invincibility, established at Cajamarca and reinforced by the impossible creatures they commanded, had fractured the Inca command structure's confidence. Military commanders second-guessed themselves. Soldiers hesitated. The divine mandate of the Inca emperor had been violated by the capture of Atahualpa. The legal proceedings surrounding Atahualpa's fate reveal how the Spanish recognized and exploited this psychological advantage. Despite collecting the promised ransom, the largest ever paid in history at that time, the Spanish decided to execute Atahualpa in July 1533. The stated reasons involved accusations of treason and ordering the death of his brother, Huáscar. The real reason was more calculated. Atahualpa alive, even imprisoned, remained a rallying point. The Spanish needed to completely break the Inca political structure, but they also needed to maintain control over a population that vastly outnumbered them. The solution was terror, demonstrating that not even the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, was safe from Spanish power and their supernatural allies. The method of execution is significant. Atahualpa was initially sentenced to be burned at the stake, a death the Inca particularly feared because their religious beliefs required an intact body for the afterlife. At the last moment, Friar Valverde offered Atahualpa a choice: convert to Christianity and be strangled instead, preserving his body. Atahualpa converted and was garroted. The Spanish chroniclers present this as mercy. The psychological warfare interpretation is darker. By forcing Atahualpa to accept the Spanish god as superior to Inti, the sun god, the Spanish weren't just killing an emperor. They were ritually demonstrating the supremacy of their entire worldview, including the creatures they commanded. What happened to the horses themselves provides another layer to this story. The 62 original cavalry horses that entered Peru became the foundation of the horse population in South America. The Spanish carefully controlled horse breeding, understanding that their monopoly on these animals was a source of power. For decades, indigenous peoples were forbidden from riding horses or owning them. This wasn't just about military advantage, it was about maintaining the mystique. Pedro de Cieza de León, who arrived in Peru in 1547, wrote extensively about the ongoing Inca resistance. He recorded something telling even 15 years after Cajamarca. Inca fighters would sometimes flee at the mere sound of approaching hooves, despite having fought Spanish cavalry before and understanding they were animals. The trauma had become cultural memory. The Spanish also discovered that different groups within the empire had different relationships with the horses. Coastal peoples, who had seen horses earlier during Spanish coastal expeditions, adapted more quickly. Highland peoples, especially those who were first exposed to horses at Cajamarca, or heard stories from survivors, maintained a more profound fear. This suggests the initial encounter's trauma mattered more than subsequent education. Decades later, when the Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, himself half Inca, interviewed elderly survivors of the Conquest, many still described the horses with a mixture of awe and horror. One survivor told Garcilaso that when he first saw a horse, he believed he was looking at the devil himself come to end the world. The cover-up, if it can be called that, came from the Spanish themselves. As they wrote official accounts of the Conquest, they emphasized Spanish courage, faith, and military skill. The critical role that Inca ignorance of horses played was downplayed. Chroniclers like Pedro Pizarro mentioned it, but the official narrative preferred to attribute victory to Spanish superiority, rather than Inca psychological vulnerability to an unfamiliar animal. This narrative served Spanish interests. If the conquest was won through courage and divine favor, it justified Spanish rule. If it was won because the Inca literally could not understand what a horse was, it suggested the Spanish had exploited catastrophic ignorance, a less glorious narrative. The political interference came later, as the Spanish crown tried to reconcile its actions with Catholic theology. If the Inca were fully rational humans with souls, conquering them through deception raised moral questions. Church authorities in Spain debated whether the conquest was just. The role of horses, creatures that seemed like gods to the Inca, complicated these debates in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. The conquest of Peru forced European powers to recognize psychological warfare as potentially more decisive than military might. Within decades, nations colonizing the Americas implemented deliberate policies about introducing unfamiliar animals, technologies, and practices to maximize confusion and fear in indigenous populations. This wasn't unique to the Americas. When Europeans later colonized Africa and Asia, they paid careful attention to what local populations had never encountered. The goal wasn't just military defeat, but psychological dominance, making resistance seem not just difficult but impossible, almost blasphemous against what seemed like supernatural power. The Cajamarca model, using cavalry to induce terror in populations unfamiliar with horses, was attempted elsewhere, though never again with such devastating success. By the time Europeans reached sub-Saharan Africa in force, horses were known, even if not universal. By the time they penetrated deeper into Asia, cavalry was an established military tradition. The Incas' isolation, their geographic separation from Eurasia, made them uniquely vulnerable to this specific type of psychological warfare. The legal and ethical implications reverberated for centuries. In 1550, the Valladolid debate in Spain brought together theologians and jurists to discuss whether conquest of the Americas was justified. Juan Jean de Sepulveda argued indigenous peoples were natural slaves requiring Spanish guidance. Bartolomé de las Casas argued they were fully human with rights. The horse question hung unspoken over these debates. Could a civilization that couldn't identify a horse be considered equal to Europeans? The debate was never fully resolved, but it established a template that would recur throughout colonialism when technological or biological knowledge gaps create decisive advantages. Are those gaps evidence of superiority or merely circumstance? Similar cases emerged as colonization expanded. When the British introduced firearms to some Indian Ocean peoples who had never encountered gunpowder, reactions paralleled the Incas' response to horses. Initial belief in supernatural causation, followed by devastating military defeats before tactical understanding developed. When European diseases like smallpox devastated American populations, some indigenous groups interpreted the pattern of Spanish immunity as evidence of divine favor, further cementing psychological dominance. The lasting impact on Andean communities was profound and remains visible today. The Spanish introduced European horses, which thrived in some Andean environments. Over generations, Andean peoples became skilled horsemen, but the cultural memory of those first encounters persisted. Colonial-era Peruvian artwork often depicts the conquistadors with deliberately enlarged horses, suggesting the psychological impact shaped artistic representation for centuries. The Inca road system, built for human runners and llama caravans, was eventually adapted for horses. The transformation of this infrastructure represented the physical manifestation of psychological conquest, taking what the Inca built and repurposing it for the very creatures that had helped destroy them. What this reveals about human nature is uncomfortable. We like to believe that knowledge and understanding are always accessible, that intelligent people can recognize and adapt to new information. The Inca were sophisticated, intelligent, with complex society and technology. But they were blindsided by an animal. Not because they were primitive, but because human cognition requires frameworks. When something violates every framework you have, when a creature exists that shouldn't be possible according to everything you know about the world, rational analysis becomes extraordinarily difficult. The modern parallels are obvious if we're willing to see them. Anytime a population encounters something genuinely novel, a technology, weapon, or concept completely outside their experience, there's a window of psychological vulnerability. The difference between a new challenge and an incomprehensible one is the difference between resistance and collapse. The 62 horses that entered Peru in 1532 were not 62 animals. They were 62 walking violations of reality itself, deployed against people who had no concept such things could exist. The physical conquest of Peru took decades more, with continued resistance and uprisings. But the psychological conquest happened in approximately 2 hours on November 16, 1532, and it happened because Francisco Pizarro understood something profound and terrible. The most effective weapon isn't the one that kills the most people. It's the one that makes people believe resistance is impossible. What do you think would have happened if the Inca had somehow encountered horses before the Spanish invasion? Could they have mounted an effective resistance if they'd had time to understand what these creatures were? Or was the technological gap simply too great? Leave your theories in the comments below. Would the conquest have failed if not for the horses, or did the Spanish have other advantages that would have won regardless? If this lost chapter of history disturbed you, make sure you're subscribed to Fierce Sermon for more stories about the moments that changed civilization forever. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another dark trut that history textbooks gloss over. We've got more episodes coming about the weapons and tactics that shaped the age of conquest, some of them far more disturbing than what you've heard today. These aren't just military histories. They're stories about how psychology, culture, and accident combine to destroy entire worlds. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another moment when ignorance became the deadliest weapon of all.